Welcome to episode 7 of our epic RV adventure with a family of 8 as we visit Boston, the Freedom Trail, Adams, and Minuteman National Historic Parks. We finished the last episode at Herkimer Diamond Mines.
In this episode, we visit our 7th state by moving into Massachusetts, and we focus our stay around the city of Boston. We set up our RV home at Hanscom Air Force Base FAM Camp. We started our visit by riding the T, or what is the subway, into Boston, and did our first day of touring the city by walking along the Freedom Trail. The Freedom Trail is a walking tour of Boston. It's basically a red line on the ground throughout the city, and if you follow it, you will see many of the most popular historical sites of the city. The trail is 2.5 miles long, and it begins in the Boston Common. Boston Common is the oldest public park in the United States, established in 1634 by the Puritans. Overlooking the Common is the Massachusetts State House, whose cornerstone was laid by Samuel Adams and Paul Revere in 1795. Down the hill from the State House is Park Street Church. The hymn America was first sung here, and abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison gave his first anti-slavery speech here in 1829. Nearby is the Granary Burying Ground. Not to be too macabre, but I found this place fascinating. Patriots John Hancock, Paul Revere, James Otis, Samuel Adams, Robert Payne, and the victims of the Boston Massacre, as well as whole families of settlers ravaged by fire and plague, are interred in this old cemetery. After another short walk, we came to King's Chapel and Burying Ground. This church was built in 1749, but because it was a stronghold of Loyalist opposition, most of the congregation left for England or Nova Scotia in 1776. The burying ground next door contains the remains of John Winthrop, the colony's first governor, as well as the gravestone that inspired Nathaniel Hawthorne to write The Scarlet Letter. Continuing around the corner, we saw a statue of Benjamin Franklin overlooking an inset mural in the sidewalk. This was the original site of the Boston Latin School, the oldest public school in America, established in 1635 by the Puritans. Benjamin Franklin, John Hancock, and Samuel Adams are among the school's noteworthy alumni. Down the street we saw the old Corner Bookstore. Originally built in 1718 as an apothecary, it eventually became a literary center in the mid-1800s as Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Louisa May Alcott, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and many others brought their manuscripts here to be published. Even Charles Dickens was known to hang out here when he was in Boston. A few steps away was the South Meeting House. This building was under renovation when we were there, so we couldn't go inside, but we marveled at its historical significance anyway. In the days leading up to the American Revolution, citizens gathered here to challenge British rule, protesting the Boston Massacre and the tax on tea. It was here, at a meeting on December 16, 1773, that Samuel Adams launched the Boston Tea Party. Our next stop was especially interesting. The old State House served as the seat of colonial and state governments as well as a merchants' exchange. Built in 1713, the building is very reminiscent of other British imperial buildings, and it even still carries the symbols of the British throne on its exterior, the lion and the unicorn. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence was proclaimed from its balcony to a jubilant crowd. 200 years later, for America's bicentennial in 1976, Queen Elizabeth II addressed the crowd on the same balcony. The inside of the old State House is a museum today. Besides the many other interesting exhibits, we saw personal belongings of John Hancock, as well as the actual Treaty of Paris, which ended the American Revolution in 1783. That was really cool. Outside the old State House, we saw costume militia demonstrators, which greatly impressed our youngest kids. On the other side of the building, underneath the famed balcony, is a cobblestone circle marking the site of the Boston Massacre, where in 1770 British soldiers fired into a crowd of Bostonians, killing 5 people. As we continued our walk along the Freedom Trail, we came to Faneuil Hall and Quincy Market. In the years leading up to the American Revolution, the assembly room on the second floor played host to many important meetings, including protests against the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Act. In the morning of the Boston Massacre, the victims were brought here and their funerals were held here 2 days later. Our next stop along the Freedom Trail was the Paul Revere House. This sits in Boston's oldest residential neighborhood, and to get to it, we had to walk through an open-air farmer's market, as well as through what's known as Little Italy. The Paul Revere House is the oldest building in downtown Boston, built in 1680. The Revere family lived in the house from 1770 to 1800. Following the Paul Revere House, we made our way to the famous Old North Church. However, we were diverted slightly along the way when we found a house giving free demonstrations on how colonists made chocolate and how a 1700s printing press operated. We were given samples of the colonial chocolate, but no one liked it because sugar wasn't added. Even our youngest son's eyes started to water from it. In the square behind the church, we saw a statue of Paul Revere on horseback and a fountain. By this point in the day, the younger boys were starting to lose interest and were more interested in the fountain than in a historical church, so we let them play around there for a little while before we entered the church. On the night of April 18, 1775, around 10 p.m., the caretaker of the Old North Church, Robert Newman, climbed up the 14-story steeple under the cover of darkness, and he hung 2 lanterns. Remember, 1 if by land and 2 if by sea. Watching and waiting were patriots, including Paul Revere, who rode through the countryside towards Lexington and Concord, alerting the Minutemen that the British were coming. The lanterns were not lit for very long. It is said that the British also saw the lanterns and they tried to capture Newman, who escaped by jumping through a church window. Interestingly, in 1975, on the 200th anniversary of the hanging of the 2 lanterns, President Gerald Ford, along with direct descendants of Robert Newman, hung 2 commemorative lanterns in the steeple, along with a 3rd lantern, which still hangs in the church today. After the Old North Church, we passed by Copp's Hill Burying Ground and crossed the Charlestown Bridge, where we could see glimpses of Boston Harbor, where the Boston Tea Party occurred. We went to see, next, the USS Constitution. This ship is the oldest commissioned warship afloat in the world, one of 6 warships commissioned by George Washington in 1794. Legend has it that during the War of 1812 against the British were astonished to see their cannonballs bounce harmlessly off the hull of the ship, and thus the ship's nickname of Old Ironsides was born. Our final stop on the Freedom Trail was the Bunker Hill Monument. 2 months after the British suffered heavy loss at the battles of Lexington and Concord, the British still held control of Boston. The colonists slipped by night onto Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill to fortify their positions, but they were discovered, and a battle ensued the next day. Ultimately, the British won this battle, but they suffered such heavy loss that their general said it was a hill too dearly bought. Just over 1,000 of their 2,000 or so soldiers were killed or wounded. The colonists lost about half that number. In 1825, the monument cornerstone was laid. There are 294 steps to the top of the monument, and Dad and the 3 older boys actually climbed all the way to the top, even after all of our days walking up to that point. We were so worn out from our walk along the Freedom Trail that the next day we all slept in before we headed to Quincy, Massachusetts to visit the Adams National Historic Park. This park memorializes the homes of 5 generations of the Adams family, starting with Deacon John Adams, father of the 2nd President of the United States, John Adams. The park itself is physically spread out. There are 5 buildings in the park, plus several smaller buildings. We started our day at the Visitor Center, where we viewed a nice documentary film about the 4 generations of the family who lived in the main house. We next rode the park trolley to the birthplaces of John Adams and his son John Quincy Adams. Both of these salt box type houses are next to each other. John Adams was born in 1735 in the house owned by his father, Deacon John Adams. He grew up there, married Abigail, and they moved into the older house literally just feet away, where their son John Quincy Adams was born in 1767. We received guided tours of each of these houses and then boarded the park trolley again. Next, we went to the mansion of John and Abigail Adams, called Peacefield. But before we toured inside, first we went to see the inside of the stone library. This was built in 1870 to house John Quincy Adams' historic books, over 14,000 of them. In his last will and testament, he requested the library to be built of stone, and to be built separately from the main house. He wanted to protect his treasured books from fire. The inside of the library was indeed a sight to behold. Finally, we had a guided tour of the inside of Peacefield, where someone from the Adams family lived continuously from 1787 until 1927. Everything inside the house used to belong to someone in the family. All the furniture, the wall hangings, everything. One thing that caught our attention was a personally autographed picture of Theodore Roosevelt. Apparently, Brooks Adams was a close friend of his. The house was very large and beautiful inside, just as Abigail Adams insisted. After our tours were completed, we enjoyed a picnic lunch on the grounds of Peacefield. Even in this late in the growing season, the floral gardens were meticulously kept and quite beautiful. On Monday, we were running out of time to see national parks before the looming government shutdown, so we took in Minuteman National Historic Park while we had the chance. We saw so many neat things in this park. As usual, we started at the Visitor Center and we watched a multimedia theater program called The Road to Revolution. It was so engaging, I wanted to watch it again. We took off driving along the Battle Road Trail. There are numerous preserved original homes along this road, which connects Lexington and Concord, but most of them were closed for the season. We did, however, stop at the Hartwell Tavern, where we met some costume demonstrators who taught us many things about the history of the area. Hartwell Tavern was the halfway point between Lexington and Concord, and anyone traveling between the two towns back in the 1700s would have stopped at this tavern along the way. Since it was a Monday morning and we were the only ones there, the kids received a lot of individual attention from the park rangers. Part of that attention was a private muster drill for the family. Each person received a wooden replica of a musket and were taught how the Minutemen would have drilled to be ready for battle. I'm not so sure what the older boys thought of that, but the younger two really enjoyed it. Afterwards, we were the only ones in attendance when one of the costumed park rangers demonstrated and actually shot his musket several times. We really enjoyed our time at Hartwell Tavern. Our next stop along the Battle Road Trail was called Miriam's Corner. This was one of the many sites along the road where battle occurred as the British were retreating from Concord. There is a grave site of an unnamed British soldier here. The next stop didn't have anything to do with the Revolutionary War, but rather with the area's unique heritage in American literature. The Wayside was the only owned home of Nathaniel Hawthorne, author of the Scarlet Letter. Louisa May Alcott spent her childhood here, and it is the inspiration for scenes in her novel, Little Women. And Margaret Sidney, author of Five Little Peppers, also lived here. Our final stop was in Concord at the famous North Bridge. It was here that the first shot of the Revolutionary War was fired. As Ralph Waldo Emerson said, it was the shot heard round the world. We walked across the bridge, saw another burial site of unnamed British soldiers, and listened to a costumed park volunteer give an account of what happened on that fateful day. At this point, we were pretty much finished exploring the national park, but there was one other stop nearby that we wanted to see, the Sleepy Hallow Cemetery. The family was familiar with the legend, and we wanted to see it for ourselves, but what we found there instead was a pleasant surprise for us all. We visited the grave sites of the area's famous authors, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and my favorite, Louisa May Alcott. It was an honor to pay homage to these literary giants. Next, as we were driving away from the Battle Road Trail, we passed the site where Paul Revere was captured, but we didn't stop because we wanted to see the Lexington Battle Green before it got too late in the day. In Lexington, we walked around the Battle Green and learned that underneath the park are buried the casualties of the battle that occurred there on April 19, 1775. From a historical and homeschooling perspective, Boston is a must-see city.